Hello and welcome. I'm Monica Warline, Faculty Director of the Center for Positive Organizations, and I'm delighted to be here to welcome you today to this Positive Link Speaker Series session, The Prepared Leader, Emerge from Any Crisis More Resilient Than Before. We are so delighted that you've joined us today. I want to share a few notes of welcome. The technology we are using today is view only, and we really invite you to silence your other technologies, lean back, sink in, and listen deeply to this important conversation. You can enable live transcription services on your own by turning the transcription setting on and off in your Zoom toolbar. And we are recording this event to share back with you in a few days. I also have the distinct privilege of thanking our partners in this series. I want to thank the Sanger Leadership Center, the Tauber Institute for Global Operations, and the Samuel and Zell Lurie Institute for Entrepreneurial Studies for their sponsorship support of the 2023-24 Positive Link Speaker Series this year. We also have partners who help us get the word out. Today, I'd like to thank Ann Arbor Spark and the Managerial and Organizational Cognition Division of the Academy of Management. And I'd like to invite any of you interested in being a series partner, a promotional partner, and a friend of our work to consider giving in any way to help us keep this series growing and thriving. We aim to feature leading scholars who offer inspiring and practical science-based strategies to help your organization thrive. And any support you can offer would be gratefully received. And my final word of welcome after all of you is to welcome my longtime colleague, core contributor to the Center of Positive Organizations, empowerment and organizational change scholar, and most recently, Associate Dean for Executive and Corporate Relations at the Ross School of Business, Gretchen Spreitzer. Gretchen, thank you for hosting this incredible leadership conversation today.
Thank you very much for that nice introduction, Monica. I'm thrilled to be here to get to talk to these two amazing University of Michigan alums today.
I will leave you to it. Thank you, Gretchen.
Great. Thank you very much. So, as I said, today we are going to have an opportunity to converse and learn from two amazing scholars who are both University of Michigan graduates. Go Blue! I just finished up lunch with the CEO of a billion-dollar construction company, and at lunch, I had this book in front of me because I was coming right over to this post-lunch, and he peppered me with questions. He's like, well, what's that book? Why are you carrying that book around? Is there a crisis at Ross right now? I said, no. I said, I'm meeting Lynn and Erika to do a fireside chat on this topic. And he said, just such an important topic. And so I'm thrilled today to get to spend some time with both Lynn and Erika and get to learn from them. They have been doing research in this field for quite a long time. Their first book together was called Leading Under Pressure: From Surviving to Thriving Before, During, and After a Crisis. And now today they'll be talking about their most recent book, The Prepared Leader. As I mentioned, I am very inspired by the two of them. I am lucky to know them from the time when we both, or all three of us, were at the University of Michigan. So Lynn Wooten and I overlapped in graduate school here at the Ross School of Business when we were both in the PhD program. She was in the strategy group and I was in the management and organizations group. Back then it was actually called OBHRM. And I got to know Lynn as a PhD student, but then we both ended up back here as faculty members. Again, Lynn was in strategy and then eventually joined our management and organizations group. But Lynn and I were also part of the Center for Positive Organizations in its early days. And Lynn was our second faculty director. So way back when, Lynn was already acting as a leader, being chosen as a leader. And I was thrilled to learn from her back then. It didn't take long before she was a senior associate dean here at the Ross School of Business. And then Cornell University nabbed her to become their dean of the Dyson School, before most recently being named the president of Simmons University, one of the most progressive universities in the nation, and based in Boston. So Lynn, thrilled to get to interact with you here today together. Erika and I also overlapped when we were both here in graduate school. Erika was in the organizational psychology department, but of course we had lots of interactions between our two different groups. I left to go to the University of Southern California, and Erika continued on doing great things. She was at the Darden School at the University of Virginia for a number of years, where she, like Lynn, moved into a leadership role quite quickly as their associate dean. And then she moved to Emory, where she was the dean for a number of years there in Atlanta. And then now most recently, since 2020, the dean at the Wharton School of Business. So I admire both of them individually as scholars and as leaders, but I also admire their friendship, how they've supported each other, how they've been mentors to each other, both personal and professionally over many years. And so I am just thrilled to get to spend a little bit of time with you here this afternoon. So let's give a warm welcome to Lynn and Erika here with us this afternoon.
Gretchen, thank you for that welcome. We're honored to be here. Of course, we have to say go blue. It's always good to be home and excited. And with that, I'm going to ask Sherry to do a screen share, and we're going to do a brief presentation before we go into our fireside chat.
Wonderful.
So the focus today briefly is about our journey, our research journey, our journey as leaders, and our journey to how we have conceptualized prepared leadership. And this notion that leaders, teams, and organizations can really emerge from a crisis and be more resilient than before. Sherry, if you go to the next slide. But to really know about our journey is really to know the story of Erika and me. Erika and I have been friends for more than 30 years. This picture dated back from the 90s when we had on our power blue Brooks Brothers suit looks, is us presenting at a research conference in Toronto. And so that's the first picture when we were grad students, PhD students. I believe the year was probably 1993. Fast forward 30 years later, almost, this is Erika at my presidential investiture here. And so for the last 3 decades, we've been friends, we've been peers, we've been collaborators, we've been mentors. And we've thought about really what does it mean to lead in a crisis situation? How are crisis opportunities? How are crises really places where we can innovate? Next slide, please. One example is a colleague, one of my former colleagues, Ruth Godden, who's at Cornell, who writes about the success factor, has written about us and talks about the power of friendtors. And all of us have these friends that are mentors, and that's what Erika and I have been to each other. And in particular, you'll learn today a lot about how we've been friendtors in a crisis situation and how we have stretched each of us to be great prepared leaders. And so as you're thinking about today's webinar, one of the questions that Erika and I want to throw out to you is that as a prepared leader, who are your friendtors? How do you give each other constructive feedback? How do you challenge you to be your best self? Are very important things that we think about in our own crisis leadership research. Next slide, please, Sherry. So our most recent topic, as I said, is really this notion of that there's some things we can prepare for as crisis leaders. And so I want to talk about how we got to this theory and conceptualization. And then I'm going to turn it over to Erika, who's going to talk about our model. Next slide, please, Sherry. So as I said, our research started in graduate school. And from day one, Erika and I knew that we really wanted to do research a little bit different. And so we consider ourselves scholars, practitioners, but we also consider ourselves in the domain of action research and all the papers and case studies and simulations we've created have gone through this process. We'll be sitting in our offices or talking on the phone, or it might even be on a family vacation. And we observe a problem or opportunity. And then we start, we tell the kids to go off and play, and we start thinking about, okay, how can we study that problem or opportunity? We do a lot of data collection and field studies, a lot of ethnographies, case studies, qualitative data, large databases. But really what we've done all of our career is taking that data and saying, how can we create actionable solutions? How can we help managers and leaders and organizations and individuals and systems and societies be better at this notion of prepared leader? And so when we're collecting the data and developing solutions, we're testing them out, we're learning reflection, and then we're developing theory. Sherry, if you can go to the next slide, please. Now, a part of that approach has been inspired, as Gretchen said, with my work for the Center for Positive Organizational Scholarships. Many people have studied crisis leadership in the communications domain, in the management domain, in public policy and government. But one of the unique aspects of the way that Erika and I approached this is that we believe even in a crisis situation, there's an opportunity for positive deviance. The quote says, it's like a flashlight. It's discovering what already exists, but it's also discovering how we can show up to be our best. It's discovering, like when you go to the doctors and you're feeling good, but you're asking the doctor, how can I feel great? Well, in crisis situations, these are the questions that we're asking. Next slide, please, Sherry. So building upon what my colleague Jane Dutton says is our approach to crisis leadership has been grounded in positive organizational scholarship and three aspects of it in general. We focus on building and creating individual teams and organizational strengths. So we're thinking about strengths. Secondly, we're thinking about capacity building. Even in crisis situations, how are you unlocking resources, potential, using your skills in building capacity? And then we focus on explaining those extraordinary behaviors, those outliers that we see in crisis situations in organizations, teams, and individuals. Next slide, please. So what has this produced? When you've been in the field for 30 years, you're able to explore and produce a lot of research. At the foundation of our career, much of the research has been journal articles like Academy of Management Journal and Organizational Dynamics. But beyond journal articles, we've written lots of book chapters. We've done monographs for leaders. We've done tools. If you go to jamesandwooten.com, any of our tools for crisis leadership are available for public domain. We've created case studies and we created simulations. So it's been a really rewarding career for action-based research. Next slide, please. But probably, as Gretchen said, maybe the pinnacle of our research really has been the two books that we have written about. Early in our career, we did more of a research book, Leading Under Pressure, where we took all of our research for the beginning part of our career and created a conceptual framework. And then now the Prepared Leader, which is more of a leadership book. They're everyday tools. We designed it really so you can read on a trip from Boston, LA, and go back and be a best prepared leader. So I'm going to turn it over to Erika, who's going to highlight some of the tools in the book and the concepts in the framework.
Thank you, Lynn. So one of the things that we have spent, to Lynn's point, 30 years understanding is what is it that actually constitutes a crisis? And if you think about what happens in your organizations or the groups that you're a part of, sometimes our own vernacular makes it seem as if every problem, every issue, everything that is unexpected is in fact a crisis, when in reality, they're defining characteristics to constitute a significant crisis for which an organization might be unprepared. So what Lynn and I have used to describe as a crisis is any negative situation or disruption that has the potential to become public, create negative stakeholder reaction, and threaten one or all of the following: the financial well-being of the organization's reputation, and the legitimacy of the organization to exist at all. And when we talk about crises, there are a number of different ways to categorize them, but there are two buckets, if you will, that we find most helpful. One is those sudden crises, and another is a smoldering crisis. And you can probably conclude for yourself what each of them means based on simply the title. Next slide, please, Sherry. So a sudden crisis is oftentimes something that is external to the organization. It is an unexpected event for which the organization generally has limited fault or responsibility. Some examples are here: a natural disaster, some kind of weather event, a terrorist attack, negative viral social media. All of these things are generally things that are outside of your span of control, that are imposed or that happen to the organization. And the interesting thing about sudden crises is that because they are oftentimes things that happen to you, the company has limited fault or responsibility. And therefore, people are much more, stakeholders, customers, employees are much more likely to want to help and participate in the resolution of that crisis. On the contrary, next slide, please, Sherry. Smoldering crises are typically considered to be things that are happening internal to the organization that generally start out pretty small. Some might even assume them to be insignificant, and therefore we don't pay attention to them until they become so significant or so numerous that they erupt into a more significant crisis situation. Examples here include product defects, labor disputes, safety violations, customer lawsuits, etc. Unlike with sudden crises, smoldering crises are generally perceived to be the fault or responsibility of the organization. And the tricky thing there for leaders is that when you are deemed to be the problem, or you contributed to this problem, people are less likely to come to your aid versus in a sudden situation where it's an externally caused event. Next slide, please. So this is always interesting. I've been involved with an organization that has collected data on the most frequently defined or described types of crises in the US for the past 20 years. And consistently, year by year, the numbers are pretty much the same. And what you might note on here is that the largest category of crises that are experienced in this country are what we've described as mismanagement, acts of mismanagement. So the revealing thing about that is we oftentimes assume that crises happen to us or that they are externally imposed. And so we prepare for the weather event, we prepare for the terrorist attack or the workplace shooting, but we don't often prepare or even recognize that it is the behavior, the choices, the decisions, the communication of many of us in managerial roles that are contributing to a vast majority of the crises that are surfacing in this country. Next slide, please. So as we do this work, most of you are likely familiar with the triple bottom line, which highlights the importance of leaders attending to people and the social dynamics in their organization, or the profit responsibility of organizations, and more recently, the focus on planet and ensuring that the environment is top of mind for business leaders. And while all of those continue to be significant responsibilities, another responsibility that Lynn and I have identified is the need for leaders to actually be prepared to effectively manage through many of the kinds of sudden or smoldering crises that we've just illuminated. And only once you are considered or prepared in your leadership are you effectively able to address the people, planet, and profit concerns that we're all addressing. Next slide. In order to be prepared, Lynn and I have done research that's highlighted a number of key things. One are crises don't just, our responsibility as leaders is not just to deal with the crisis after it's happened, but to actually anticipate and think about and prepare for what makes the organization vulnerable. Then once something does happen, our responsibility is to engage in damage control. And then we move forward to how do we recover from the situation that we've just dealt with, recognizing that the world continues to evolve while we've been focused on managing a crisis. So we've got to get back to the business at hand and then move the organization forward. and using the skills and the work involved in learning and reflecting on that crisis to fully realize the proverbial opportunities that people say come from crisis. And in order to be effective leaders across those 5 phases, we've identified some supporting competencies in each phase. And I won't take the time now to go through these, but you'll see many of them make sense. When you are engaged in damage control, you have to communicate effectively. You have to be willing to take risks to solve a problem in ways that you've never experienced before. Next slide, please. So we wanted to just give you one example of the ways in which a particular industry is focused on, or should be focused on, a potential threat or vulnerability to its industry. And that is in the field of nursing. Some experts have said, many experts have said that there is such a severe shortage in the nursing field that unless it is addressed, we're going to see hospitals ill prepared to address some of the existing challenges that they're facing. One of which is the influx and growing numbers of baby boomers and the health issues that correspond to aging. We're still dealing with the COVID pandemic, and therefore, as there are different points in time where we might see a surge in those cases, the demand on hospital care and nurses in particular continues to spike. And when we don't have the necessary workforce to address these challenges, that is a potential threat and crisis to the industry and for hospitals. And so a prepared leader will begin to identify ways to engage opportunities to address this problem even before we see the ramifications of the shortage. Next slide, please. So while we offered an example of signal detection for our work, Lynn and I, over the span of our time working together, we've explored many different organizations and across those different 5 phases. And one of the most recent ones, which we'll highlight here, is the National Basketball Association. As we were writing the book, The Prepared Leader, that time period in history corresponded with the pandemic. And one of the things that was central for Lynn and I was to identify, how do we capture this crisis that everyone in the world is experiencing? And how do we learn which organizations have done a really significant job at pursuing the business and the work of that organization, even amidst one of the most horrific worldwide global crises that we've ever experienced. And the National Basketball Organization or Association was such a wonderful example because their leadership said, the show must go on. We will continue, but we recognize we have to do things differently. We cannot have arenas with thousands of people together at a time when this rapidly growing virus is spreading. And so they were creative in how they continued with their season by sort of having people come together and sheltering in place, if you will, all of the different basketball teams and preventing them from being out in the universe and potentially being exposed to the virus. And in so doing, it might not have been a pleasant experience, but they allowed the rest of us to take some level of comfort because we were still able to experience joy by watching basketball because of the creative way in which their NBA leaders had addressed that situation. Next slide, please. So at the end of the day, what is the goal or responsibility for being a prepared leader? Fundamentally, what we're trying to achieve is to create the proverbial opportunity from the crisis, or how do you actually make lemonade from when life gives you lemons? So the opportunity is, in fact, to recognize what's possible from having learned and gone through those important situations. And we have here an example from one of the tools that we have on our website, which is, once your organization has experienced a crisis, how do you bring your team together and talk about what have we learned? How do we improve profitability? How do we identify new products because we've had to fundamentally do things differently? How do we create operational improvements as a result of the experience that we had going through this crisis? So this is an important tool to really be able to leverage the benefits that can come from crisis situations. And with that, I will turn it back over to Lynn.
So often Erika and I are asked about how can we be a prepared leader in our own roles? Me as the president of Simmons University and Erika as the Wharton School of Business Dean. The one thing I can say is we realize that it's easier to write and study other organizations than lead in our roles. But higher education is also in this midst of a crisis that calls for prepared leadership. And when you think about our model, a lot of things are happening. Erika and I both took our presidency on July 1st of 2020. And so our first 18 months was all about managing universities in a pandemic era. And as we come in this post-pandemic era, we're thinking a lot about also what does it mean to lead in higher education. But it's not only the post-pandemic era that's a challenge or opportunity for prepared leadership. There's the war on affirmative action and diversity and inclusion and legacy and missions and how we recreate universities to be inclusive. There's escalating tuition and costs, and especially for me, the struggle of small universities and new business models. We have a society that's questioning the value proposition of higher education and competing demands for alternative credentialing. And so this is a smoldering crisis as we reinvent higher education. And then, there's also the standards that higher education leaders are expected to uphold, expected to be the CEO, the chief well-being officer, the CDO, all of these different roles and these standards. So I can say we have the opportunity once again to do action-based research, even in our own leadership journey. Next slide, please, for Erika.
Okay, so we thought we would end with a personal story that actually does describe Lynn and I mobilizing into action in the midst of a crisis. This slide highlights the news story that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and that is the horrific fires that happened on the island of Maui over the summer. So why are we sharing this particular example with you? So happens that Lynn's son was scheduled to get married in Hawaii on the island of Maui, in the area of Lahaina, which is the area that caught fire, the exact same week that the fire happened. And I'll never forget, Lynn and I both on separate planes flying from the East Coast of the United States to Maui, and I'm receiving text messages at 30,000 feet in the air from Lynn saying, "Have you heard about the fires in Maui?" And I said, "No." I start, looking into this, and I'm thinking to myself, it's not going to be a problem. This is fine. People are overreacting. And of course, the closer and closer we are to landing in Maui, I'm getting text messages, or I'm hearing the pilot say, we might need to divert because they're not landing planes in Maui, et cetera. And we're recognizing just how severe this situation is. And for Lynn, also trying to anticipate, what does this mean for the wedding that's supposed to happen in 2 days? Next slide, please. So fortunately, we were surrounded by wonderful friends and family members who were able to mobilize while Lynn was on the plane and start to identify alternative locations to host the wedding, alternative, bakeries and florists and all of the things that you need to put a wedding together, which one plans for generally over months, was planned for in about 24 hours. And the resolution was to move the wedding from the island of Maui to Honolulu. And fortunately, Lynn is surrounded by wonderful friends and family who made all manner of efforts to adapt their schedules, find ways to get to Honolulu on very short notice, and ultimately attend the wedding of her son and her new daughter-in-law, Angela. And it turned out to be a beautiful affair, but it really required everyone working and mobilizing to become prepared and effective crisis leaders. So last slide, please. So over the past year since authoring The Prepared Leader, when Lynn and I are doing speaking engagements, people will often ask us what we do to stay motivated and how we, what the playlist would be to our life when we think about being crisis leaders and we talk about this work. And so we wanted to share with you our personal playlist of songs that really inspire us and motivate us and keep us going as leaders, as friends, as colleagues, as professionals doing really hard work. And so although we're not going to play these songs for you now, we do hope that they remind you of wonderful music, and maybe you'll take some time yourself to brighten your day with some of these songs. Last slide. Right.
Wow. Thank you. That you had me on the edge of my seat with the wedding story. I was hearing little bits and pieces of it when it was occurring, because Lynn's husband, David, is here at the University of Michigan. So I did hear a little bit about it, but didn't hear all the how stressful that it was in those moments. I think there might be a case you guys could write about that.
Oh, there's definitely a case study in that question.
Justin might love that you write a case about him, but I think you could, yes. So thank you for sharing the examples, but also the frameworks and the toolkits too. I think that is so crucial for leaders to be able to have, toolkits that they can refer to, that they can draw on as they're preparing themselves, and then also as they're reacting to crises as they're happening. So what I'd love to do in our time together is to put you on the spot a little bit. And I asked them if they were okay with me doing this. I'd like to learn a little bit more about your own experiences you shared the Maui example, and that was wonderful. But I also know in your many years as leaders that you've played out these dynamics in your own work lives and in your own personal lives. And so I'd love for us to get to know you both a little bit more as human beings, and what some of the what's been some of the most difficult moments for you, but also what some of the most uplifting moments are when you've been able to create opportunities out of crises. So I'd love to first start with the question of, how do you stay focused on listening and learning in the middle of a crisis when it's happening? I'm sure there's so much pressure to act, a bias toward action. And so I'd love to learn from each of you a little bit about, how do you stay calm? How do you stay present? How do you listen so that you're learning along the way in a crisis?
Gretchen, I can start. Yeah, I can say that higher ed has been one crisis after another. And so I'm often called upon to stay calm, to listen. And for me, it starts with the team. So I'm spending a lot of time with those people around me, whether it be my personal board of directors in my personal life or in my professional life, my leadership cabinet. And I'm saying there's a crisis that's happening, but we all have to take time to pause and reflect. Let's listen to each other. Let's make sure the experts in the room have a voice and pay attention to them, but also the people who don't have an expert, who see the world differently. So inclusive leadership practices have been very important to me. Creating psychologically safe environments. We try a lot, we experiment, we give each other grace, and then we come back and learn and reflect. So my whole first year at Simmons, I didn't see my leadership team because we were in the middle of the pandemic. We were working remote. But I had to put these practices of listening online, gathering, convening, times for grace, pause, and reflection.
Erika,
So
you'd add?
one of the interesting things about Lynn and I is that our careers have followed each other. So within the same year, on more than one occasion, when she has assumed a new leadership role somewhere, I also assumed a new leadership role, and we've just mirrored each other. So the example that she just described about starting at Simmons in the early stages of the pandemic was also my experience, because she and I started our respective roles, she at Simmons, me as Dean of Wharton, on the exact same day. And so again, trying to manage remotely was a significant test I think, of crisis leadership for new leaders in particular. But I'll also share, Gretchen, your question was largely around how do you pause and reflect and listen.
Listen.
And and that was a necessary skill for me again, just over the past several months. I'm sure everyone on this call is quite familiar with the upheaval in higher education and with several presidencies, including the president of my institution, the University of Pennsylvania. And the reason I'm bringing this particular example up is that the Wharton School stakeholders, many of whom were key participants in the challenges associated with what we experienced here at the University of Pennsylvania. And so navigating between alumni of the school that I lead and the leadership of the school that I am a part of required very skillful communication. And the biggest skill I think that was necessary at that point was to listen and understand what the needs were from both parties, many of who have had very competing interests, and be that interpreter and listen well enough to be able to convey to the other side what each party was trying to communicate. And that, I think, really both challenged my listening skills, but also over time began to improve my listening skills.
And just drawing on that, thank you for sharing that, Erika. I was, following it from a distance and thinking, gosh, how difficult that must be in the moment, because both of you in your roles are so visible, right? And people are paying a lot of attention to you. I know when, I've been in difficult situations here, I know that people are looking to me to say, how big of a problem is this? How is Gretchen reacting, or how is Ardeen reacting? Is the sky falling, or is there hope that we're going to recover? So people are really paying attention. I guess you both brought up the fact that in this very, like uncharted territory with COVID, do you think it helped that you were brand new leaders in your setting, or did that make it that much harder to be able to lead?
For me, I think it made it harder because there are people I never met in person for a whole year. And yeah, Erika?
Well, I would have, so yes, I agree that there were many aspects of that first year that made it difficult because we didn't have relationships to draw on. But on the other hand, it also made it easier because it created an opportunity for change within the organization. People were open and receptive, and the circumstances required things to be done in new and different ways. And sometimes I think as someone who is a part of the organization, it can become more difficult to foster or promote change. But when you're when you're an outsider, and you have circumstances that are requiring you to change, people are more willing and accepting of the change that you might invoke.
Yeah.
I agree with Erika in that point. And Gretchen, I often say the three H's had to change quickly because of the pandemic. And the crisis had to be an opportunity: higher education, hospitality, and healthcare. And if you remember, if you would have said January 1st of 2020 that we could have ran universities online, Michigan, Simmons, and University of Penn would have said no way. And now we see we can do that. So the pressure to use the pandemic as an opportunity to reinvent higher education was really a great opportunity for Erika.
Yeah, I remember hearing, I think it might have been Gretchen Whitmer, our governor, or maybe it was Jennifer Granholm. I remember one of our amazing women governors of Michigan, and they talked about there's nothing so helpful as a good crisis for making change, right? And when you're in the status quo, it's much harder. Of course, it's so difficult in a crisis, but maybe in those situations, there's more openness to it because you just know the status quo isn't going to work. And so maybe that was, Lynn, I think you're absolutely right. You didn't have the relationships and the trust already there, but you also at the same time had an opportunity because the status quo just wasn't going to be able to be sustained. Yeah, thank you. So I guess my second question, again, kind of wanting to learn a little bit more personally about how you are interacting with each other is, I love, Erika, how you talked about like how you're almost like joined at the hip. When one has, something new, the other one also has something new. And if I didn't know you were such good friends, I would say, wow, they're trying to one up each other. And I know that's absolutely not true. But how do you support each other as you're going through crisis and work in life? In COVID, you were both going through the same, the same external event at the same time, but that's not always the case. There might be something happening in your institution or in your life and not happening to the other. So I loved your story of, texting on the airplane, but, how do you help support each other when you have such full jobs and lives already? How do you create the time and the space to be supportive of each other? And are there other people that are really important parts of your support team too? You don't have to name names, but like the buckets of people that are part of your support system. Lynn, I know you mentioned your personal board of directors, so maybe that's part of your support team.
So of course there is our husband and our children, our biggest fans, and they give us great feedback too. But one of the ways is that I think we are truly committed to supporting each other. So we talk often. So when Erika's out of the country, I'm like, oh my God, what am I going to do? Those type of things. So we definitely talk often. We're very intentional also about making time. So we try to spend holidays together. We have a trip we take our daughters to every year. So lots of time, lots of listening, lots of speed dial, and our teams know each other too. So our teams know how to support each other and work together.
Yeah, I would say, I think, when you've been friends with someone for 30 years, you know a lot about each other. And when you've not only been friends with one another, but you've been in the same field, I can relate to the experiences that Lynn is having in higher education, and she can relate to mine. And so sometimes, they say leadership is lonely. And when I can't have conversations with my colleagues, because it would be inappropriate, the things I would want to talk about, I know I can talk to Lynn and she will understand because she is experienced in that way as well. So we really rely on each other pretty significantly. And when she says we talk often, we talk every day and sometimes multiple times a day. So there's a history there that we can really depend on.
Yeah. And Lynn, you mentioned, that your families are willing to give you feedback. I'm sure you're also willing to give each other, not just lift each other up feedback, but, maybe something the other person needs to hear. And you're right, Erika, that sometimes leaders can't get that kind of really helpful feedback because people, want to be nice to them or, are afraid to, be the bearer of bad news. So what a gift that you are to each other in that way.
And Gretchen, we've built a big network for being in the field 30 years. So there are lots of people in higher education that we can call upon. Often I will call on Martha Pollack, who's president of Cornell, for example, who was provost at Michigan, Donica Varner, who used to be here, was at Cornell. We both will call on David Thomas at Morehouse. And so it's having those people in higher education that call upon us, but people we can call on and speed dial in a second and get feedback too.
Yeah. And how you build that social capital before you need it, right? Those are relationships you're working on building that you're helping each other out. And then when you need something, they're going to be there.
Yeah. I often think about Wayne's reciprocity. And so that's exactly that. It's not just calling when we need something, but it's building trust and this social capital.
I would just add, Gretchen, you said something really vital that Lynn and I also talk about in the book, and that is building relationships before you need them. And as a leader, we have to do that with our teams. And we have to build that trust, not only the trust that we have in our team, but the trust that our team has in us. So that in bad times, when there is a crisis, we already have that reservoir of goodwill with our employees and customers and others. So the notion of relationship building is really vital. And without those relationships, it becomes much more difficult to be a leader during crisis.
Yeah. So I have this is not like a question so much about you in your own crisis, but you maybe helping leaders giving some suggestions to leaders who are in the middle of a crisis right now. So I'm thinking now of David Calhoun, who is the CEO of Boeing, and he's been in the news recently with what I would term to be a smoldering crisis rather than a sudden crisis, using your terminology. There, I read a interview, or I read a synopsis of him talking to his team and talking about what happened recently, where the door hole
Right.
came out while the plane was flying. And he talked to his team, to his organization, about having to fix our mistake, like taking ownership of our mistake. And, some people would say, wow, you're like putting yourself out there for liability, or, maybe leaders should never admit mistakes in a crisis. But I guess, I'm seeing some indicators that he's, trying to be open and transparent in this crisis. Is there some specific advice that you would, if he were to come to you and say, I need your help, what would you advise him to do to take this very difficult situation of a smoldering crisis, and what would be the next steps to try to help turn this from damage control into an opportunity for learning and growth? What would you suggest to him?
Yeah, a lot of what we've studied, and we actually started with the Texaco scandal, that was our back in the 90s, and looking at the discrimination lawsuits there. And the initial framework said that when you have a crisis situation, you admit your mistake. You go beyond rhetoric, you try to clean it up, but then you have to be honest with your stakeholders and say, this is how we're going to improve the organization. This is what we learned. This is how we're making the situation better. So he seems to be doing all the right steps, but the confidence building really does come from, okay, this is how I'm going to improve the situation, be a better organization, take care of the problem. And this is what we learned, and building those systems of learning from the crisis, the way we saw with the Tylenol. I mean, that's a classic one from decades ago, and how they changed product tampering. Where is this an opportunity for Boeing to fix the problem short-term and long-term? And how is the organization going to be engaged in the learning around it?
The other thing that I would add is oftentimes leaders get so consumed with responding to the crisis at hand that they sometimes take their eye off the fact that they're still running an organization that has to continue and be strategic at the same time. And in the absence of thinking and working strategically, when they come out of the crisis, they will be behind. In Boeing's case, they don't have a lot of competitors, but other organizations might be behind their competition because they've been so focused on managing this one issue that the rest of the industry has not had to deal with, that they've got a lot of room to make up. And so being able to effectively be a strategic leader while also responding to a crisis is a really important reminder that we try to give to leaders and CEOs.
Yeah, I think that is so important. And again, where you need to have a really good team, because maybe you're going to have your eye on this, but you need other people who are able to keep the other parts of the organization moving forward. And that gives people a sense of hope for the future too, right? That it's not just damage control about this, but it's that we're setting the stage for improving this organization to be able to thrive into the future.
Gretchen, in my organization, I talk about honest hope, right? It's not this false hope that everything's going to be solved, but honest hope is that we're in this together, and this is the pathway, and we're being realistic about it.
Yeah, and I think, Lynn, you're absolutely right that we hope to create some good momentum, but it's not going to be all a straight line, right? There's going to be some bumps along the way, and we're going to have to maneuver around those as they are happening. You both mentioned kind of the crisis of higher education. One of the things that I know we've spent a lot of time at the University of Michigan talking about, and we've seen a lot of other college leaders talk about as well, is when to put statements out about things that are happening in the world versus, maybe not saying anything at all. And I think, we've seen various levels of success of different schools saying things or not how do you, I'm not asking for your own, like, what did you do, but how would you think about under what conditions and when I might want to put something out there, when it might not just be my own crisis, but about something that's happening in the world?
So
You know,
this is
it's a
something,
hard decision. Go ahead first, Erika.
this is something that my own thinking has evolved over I would say the past 10 years.
Mhm.
And where I am now, which might not be where I am 5 years from now, but uh, I think I understand and recognize and have experienced acutely the reality that every leader has to manage the expectations of a plethora of stakeholders. Even within the organization, our employees, for example, might feel very differently one from another. In our case, we have faculty, we have staff, we have students, we have alumni. Within each of those buckets, people will feel differently and want and need different things from the organization, and certainly across each of those buckets. So it is impossible to think that even though we might feel very strongly what the organizational values are, and we might want to respond on behalf of the organization in a manner that's consistent with those values, it will draw attention and potentially negative attention from somebody, because you're never going to be able to please everyone. And so where I am now is, I'm not sure that it is in the best interest of the organization to put out a statement on behalf of the organization, because you're not speaking for one person, you're speaking for hundreds or thousands of people. But I do think it is a leader's responsibility to create an environment that allows members of that organization to speak for themselves or to engage in activity that will highlight what matters to them in that particular issue. And we give the same kind of space for people who disagree or people who have different views and different perspectives. Increasingly, that is the true value of diversity. And I think the leader's role is allowing that diverse perspective to come out in its various forms, and not necessarily attempt to be the singular voice on behalf of a wide swath of people and stakeholders.
Sometimes I think about checklists, Gretchen. So I think about, does it impact the community's well-being? Does the community need to be grounded in the crisis that's happening in the moment? And is my statement aligned with what our business is? So the business of higher education, or how we are as a community member. And so sometimes I say no to a statement, sometimes I say yes. And as Erika said, a lot of these statements are about stakeholder management and the various different audiences that you have. And so it's a no-win situation almost, right?
Yeah, and I love in both of your examples, and Erika, came out particularly in your example, is that prepared leaders are learning over time, right? So where you were 2 years ago is not the same as where you're at right now. And that's so important in being a prepared leader, is learning from prior experiences. And Lynn, you brought up a really important point too. It's like, I want to have a voice on things that are about, if it's very specific to higher education. So maybe it's the affirmative action decision, which is going to affect how we do admissions or something like that. So very, very helpful, but very, very complicated. So I'd love to end. We just have a few minutes remaining. I'd like to end with something kind of fun at the end, because we've talked about some very hard and complicated issues. This is my reminder so that we don't go over. So we have time for these 4 quick lightning round questions. So we know that being a leader in a crisis is exhausting and depleting. So coffee or tea during a crisis, what do you use to stay awake and vital? Lynn?
Green tea.
Green tea, me too. Woo.
You green tea.
Hot chocolate.
Okay, breaking the rules.
Sorry.
Erika, yeah. I love it. All right. Second lightning round question. First person you call when you're alerted of a crisis at work?
For me, it's my husband.
Yep, David Wooten for me.
Okay, all right. So go right to the, the person closest to you
Yep.
who will really listen. All right. Third
Well,
question.
we didn't say that.
Whoops, sorry. Your biggest strength, your biggest individual strength as a prepared leader.
For me, it's seeing around corners and anticipating what the vulnerabilities are.
For me, it's creating learning teams.
And that's what makes you guys so good together. You complement, you don't have the same strengths, you
Right.
complement each other. And the last lightning round question, what's the purpose that helps sustain you through difficult times like crises?
For me, it's the power of higher ed to change lives. And I've chosen a profession in an industry where even in crisis situations, I know that we're mobilizing people to be their best selves.
And for me, this is going to sound strange, but I have to fall in love with the people that I'm working on behalf of. And when I'm in organizations where I can legitimately say, I love this organization, I love these people, I feel that kind of deep connection to them, then that is sort of the motivation that I need to work through really complicated issues and times, because I'm doing it for the love that I have of the institution and the people within it.
Well, I have a hunch that a lot of people who have been listening to the both of you today would feel like, gosh, I would love to be part of your team because you guys really, really have what it takes to guide an organization through challenging times, both as scholars, but also as practitioners. So I'm deeply appreciative of you taking this time. I know you both have super busy schedules. I hope today was a little bit of a booster shot of purpose. Our former dean used to talk about that, having opportunities for a booster shot of purpose. Often it was interacting with stakeholders. Today you just got to interact with me, but you know there are hundreds and hundreds of people out there listening to you and learning from you. So I hope that was a booster for you. So a big thanks to both of you for being with us today, and to our audience today, who I know learned a lot. To all of you who are watching today, we will be emailing you in the next few days, and we'll share a video link and additional resources as relevant from Erika and Lynn. And so with that, I'm going to end the session by saying, go blue.
Go blue.
Go blue.
Thank you so much. Have a good rest of your afternoon. And now we will all be much more prepared for whatever is going to come at us next, which today sounds like it could be weather here in Michigan, some ice on the way.
Don't know.
So thank you guys.